I've always known my family dynamic wasn't exactly balanced. Growing up, my parents clearly favored my sister Rachel. She's 4 years older than me, and honestly, it was exhausting being compared to her at every turn. Rachel got the latest gadgets, designer clothes, and all the attention a girl could ask for. Meanwhile, I made do with hand-me-downs and worked part-time jobs from the age of 16 to afford the things I wanted. I didn't complain much, though. I had pride in my independence and knew my parents weren't obligated to give me anything beyond the basics. That said, it still stung watching Rachel walk through life on a path seemingly paved with gold dot. The favoritism became glaringly obvious 3 years ago when Rachel got married. My parents gifted her and her husband $400,000 to help them buy a stunning home in an upscale neighborhood. At the time, I was genuinely happy for her. At least, that's what I told myself. Deep down, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of unfairness. I reminded myself that I had my own life going for me. I was doing well as a software engineer, dating Mike, now my husband, and had saved up a decent amount of money. Surely when my time came, things would even out, right? Fast forward to last year, Mike proposed, and I was ecstatic. We'd been together for years, and he was everything I could have hoped for in a partner. We wanted a modest wedding, not extravagant, but elegant and meaningful. We set a budget of $36,000, aiming to keep things reasonable so we could save for the future. To my surprise, my parents offered to pay for the wedding. It wasn't something I had expected, and honestly, it caught me off guard. For once, it felt like they were seeing me, like they wanted to celebrate my happiness as much as they had celebrated Rachel's. They were enthusiastic, asking about venues and offering ideas for vendors. I thought, maybe this is their way of making things right. The day of the wedding was perfect. We had a small, intimate ceremony with our closest friends and family. My parents gave heartfelt speeches, danced with us, and seemed genuinely happy. For the first time in years, I felt like their daughter, not an afterthought. Then, 2 days later, everything unraveled. I opened an email from my father expecting something warm, a photo from the wedding, maybe a sweet message. Instead, I found a cold, itemized invoice for the wedding expenses. Attached as a PDF, it detailed every single cost: the venue, flowers, catering, even the napkins. The total came to $35,463.89. The email itself was short and detached. Please settle this at your earliest convenience. Your mother and I expect prompt payment. I stared at the screen in disbelief, my stomach churning. This couldn't be real. I showed the email to Mike, who was equally outraged. The issue wasn't the money. We could cover it if we had to. But the sheer audacity of treating their gift as a loan, as though I were some stranger. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Rachel's $400,000 wedding gift was no strings attached, a gesture of love and support. But when it came to me, they dangled generosity in front of me, only to snatch it away. It felt like a cruel reminder that I would always be second-best. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed years of moments when Rachel was celebrated while I was overlooked. The favoritism, the dismissive attitudes, all of it boiled to the surface. By morning, I knew I had to do something. I wrote a check for the full amount and mailed it to my parents, along with a letter. I poured my heart into that letter, explaining how hurt I was. I reminded them that I'd been independent since I was 16, paying my own way through life. I told them how, for a fleeting moment, I thought they finally saw me as their equal, as someone deserving of their love and care. Instead, they blindsided me with this invoice, treating me like an outsider. I told them this would be the last financial interaction we ever had. From now on, I wouldn't accept any offers of help, support, or gifts from them, not even an inheritance. The check and letter were mailed the same day. Then I blocked their numbers. I didn't want to give them a chance to twist the narrative or guilt me into compliance. Mike supported my decision completely. He held me as I sobbed that night, finally releasing the years of hurt I'd been holding inside. But that wasn't the end of it. The fallout began almost immediately. Messages from extended family flooded in. Texts, calls, voicemails, all echoing the same sentiment. I was ungrateful and dramatic. My parents had done so much for me, they said, and I was blowing things out of proportion. Then Rachel called. She was furious, accusing me of tearing the family apart. She insisted that I should have just paid the invoice without making a fuss. "You're being selfish," she yelled through the phone. "Why can't you just be grateful for once?" Her words confirmed what I had known all along. Rachel would always side with them, no matter how unreasonable their actions were. I didn't respond. For once, I refused to let their manipulation drag me back into the cycle of hurt and guilt. But the real question lingered in my mind. Was I in the wrong for cutting ties? Or was this the only way to finally stand up for myself? After mailing the check and blocking my parents, I felt a wave of relief, like I could finally breathe again. For once, I had stood my ground, drawing a line in the sand after years of being treated like I didn't matter. But that sense of calm didn't last long. The messages started pouring in a day later. At first, I thought it would just be my parents trying to reach me from different numbers. But no, this was worse. Extended family members, some I hadn't heard from in years, began texting and calling, all with the same message. I was ungrateful, dramatic, and cruel. They told me I should be thankful for parents who were willing to spend so much on my wedding, who only wanted to teach me a life lesson. That phrase, a life lesson, kept coming up. Apparently, my parents had already spun their narrative, telling everyone they sent the invoice as a harmless joke to help me understand the value of money. They never intended to cash the check, they claimed, and were just waiting to see if I'd be responsible enough to pay them back. Hearing that made my blood boil. A joke? A lesson? Who sends an invoice as a joke? Rachel, of course, was leading the charge. She showed up at my apartment unannounced 2 days after the letter. I wasn't surprised. Rachel has always loved being the center of family drama, and this was the perfect opportunity to swoop in as the golden child, the fixer. She banged on my door, yelling my name loud enough for the neighbors to hear. At first I thought about ignoring her, but something in her tone made me curious. I quietly started recording on my phone before I even got up. "Emily, open the door! You're being ridiculous!" she shouted, her voice sharp and angry. "You're blowing this way out of proportion and you know it!" I didn't respond, just sat on the other side of the door, phone in hand, listening. She kept going. "Mom and Dad didn't mean to hurt you. They're worried about you. They were just trying to teach you about financial responsibility." I almost laughed. Financial responsibility? Coming from Rachel? The same Rachel who had never worked a day in her life, who still had our parents paying for her phone bill, her car, and God knows what else. Hearing her talk about responsibility while I had been working since I was a teenager, saving and planning for my future, was infuriating. But I stayed silent, letting her rant. "They love you, Emily," she said, her tone softening slightly. "You're being so selfish. Do you have any idea what this is doing to the family? You're tearing us apart." When I didn't answer, she started pounding on the door again. "You need to apologize to them, pay the money and move on. Stop making everything about you." That was when I stopped recording. I knew nothing I said would get through to her, and I wasn't about to waste my breath. Rachel had always been their biggest supporter, their perfect golden child. She couldn't see the favoritism because she'd never been on the other side of it. Eventually, Rachel left. But not before hurling one last comment through the door. "You're acting like a spoiled brat. I hope you're happy cutting us all off over something so stupid." When she was finally gone, I just sat there feeling drained. Her words echoed in my head. Selfish, spoiled, tearing the family apart. I knew I wasn't wrong to stand up for myself, but that didn't make it hurt any less. By the time I checked my phone, I had even more messages waiting for me. A few family friends had joined in, parroting the same lines. "Your parents love you. You're lucky they wanted to help. You're being ungrateful." One text stood out, though. It was from Aunt Judy, one of my dad's sisters. We'd never been particularly close, but she had always seemed reasonable. "Emily," she wrote, "I heard what happened. I know things have been tense, but please try to see this from your parents' perspective. They've always cared about you, even if it doesn't seem like it. You're lucky to have parents who are involved in your life. Don't throw that away over a misunderstanding." Lucky? That word made my stomach turn. I wasn't lucky. I had spent my entire life watching Rachel get everything handed to her while I had to fight for even a sliver of attention. My parents' involvement had always been conditional, based on whether I played by their rules. The messages kept coming for days, each one piling on the guilt, but I ignored them all. Tom was my anchor through it all, reminding me that I had nothing to feel guilty about. "This isn't about money," he said one night as I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone. "It's about control. They've been using money to manipulate you for years, and you finally said no. Of course they're upset." He was right. This was about more than a wedding invoice. It was about decades of being treated as less than, of feeling like I was only ever worth what I could give back to them. A week later, I received an email from my mother. It slipped through because she used her work email, which I hadn't blocked. The subject line simply read, "A misunderstanding." I hesitated before opening it, already dreading what I might find. The email was long and self-righteous, filled with excuses and justifications. She claimed the invoice had never been serious, that it was meant as a lesson in financial responsibility. According to her, they had always planned to tear up the check and surprise me with $100,000 as a real wedding gift. I stared at the screen, feeling numb. A life lesson? A joke? Who does that to their own child? It was so manipulative, so cruel, that I couldn't even process it at first. They wanted to see if I would comply, if I would jump through their hoops like I always had. It wasn't about love or fairness. It was about control. Without hesitation, I mobile deposited the check I had sent them. If they wanted to play games, fine, but they weren't getting the satisfaction of ripping it up. I replied to my mother's email with a single line, "Thank you for confirming this was a deliberate test." Then I blocked her work email too. That should have been the end of it. But of course it wasn't. The day after I sent that reply to my mom, things took a turn I hadn't expected. Rachel wasn't done yet. It was late evening when I heard her again, at my apartment door. This time she wasn't just knocking. She was pounding, screaming my name loud enough for the entire building to hear. "Emily, open the door, this is ridiculous." I didn't even get up. I just sat on the couch staring at my phone. Part of me wanted to record it again, but I was too drained to bother. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to Mom and Dad? They're heartbroken, Emily. All they wanted was to help you." Her voice cracked, like she was on the verge of tears, but I wasn't buying it. I'd heard her fake cry plenty of times growing up to know the difference. When I didn't answer, she kept going, her voice growing louder, angrier. "You're acting like a spoiled brat. They were trying to teach you something important, and instead you've made this about you. God, you've always been so selfish." Selfish. There it was again. I clenched my jaw, my fingers gripping the edge of the couch cushion. "I'm the one who's selfish?" I muttered under my breath. Rachel was the last person who had any right to call me selfish. This was the same woman who had been handed everything on a silver platter her entire life, who had a $400,000 wedding gift, who had never worked a day in her life, never had to worry about bills or budgeting, because our parents had always been there to pick up the slack. Meanwhile, I had been working since I was a teenager, saving, scrimping, planning every step of my life so I could have something for myself. But sure, I was the selfish one. When I didn't respond, Rachel started hammering on the door again. "You're tearing this family apart, Emily. Over what? Money? Is that what this is about? You're willing to throw everything away because of a stupid invoice?" I stood up then, but not to answer the door. I grabbed my phone, hit record, and sat back down. "You're better than this," she shouted. "Or at least I thought you were. Do you know how hard Mom and Dad worked to make your wedding happen? And this is how you thank them? By cutting them off and acting like a victim?" Her words burned, but not for the reasons she thought. What stung was how deeply she believed them. Rachel didn't just side with our parents. She truly thought they were the victims in all of this. After another few minutes of yelling, she finally left, but her parting words stuck with me. "I hope you're happy, Emily. You've ruined everything." When she was gone, I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Tom came out of the bedroom, where he'd been staying quiet to avoid escalating the situation. "That was intense," he said softly, sitting beside me on the couch. I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "It's like she'll never see it. She'll never understand." Tom put his arm around me, pulling me close. She doesn't want to understand. It's easier for her to side with them. You standing up for yourself probably scares her, makes her question everything. I didn't say anything, but he was right. Rachel was so wrapped up in being the favorite that she couldn't see the bigger picture, and maybe she didn't want to. That night, more texts rolled in from family members, uncles, aunts, cousins. Most of them echoed Rachel's sentiment, accusing me of being selfish, dramatic, and ungrateful. One cousin even wrote, "Do you know how lucky you are to have parents who care enough to spend that kind of money on your wedding? You're acting like a brat." That word again, lucky. I wasn't lucky. I'd never been lucky. The messages were relentless, but one stood out. It was from Uncle Rob, my dad's younger brother. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but his name brought back vague memories of someone who had always seemed different. Detached from the family drama, quieter, more reserved. His text was short. "I heard what's happening. If you want to talk, I'm here." For a moment, I debated ignoring it. After all, I wasn't in the mood for yet another lecture about gratitude. But something about the way he phrased it, no judgment, no accusations, made me hesitate. I replied, "Sure. When?" The next evening, we spoke on the phone. Rob's voice was calm, almost soothing, and as he started talking, it quickly became clear why he'd reached out. "I've been where you are, Emily," he said, his tone heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "Your dad and I, we don't have a great history, and honestly, neither did our parents." He told me about something that happened 20 years ago, long before I was old enough to understand family politics. My grandparents had tried to pull a similar stunt with him, using money as leverage to manipulate him into compliance. When he refused to play along, they turned the family against him, painting him as ungrateful and selfish. "They cut me off," Rob said simply. "Financially, emotionally, completely. And for years I was the black sheep. The story everyone told was that I was greedy, that I didn't appreciate everything they'd done for me. It took me a long time to realize it wasn't about me. It was about control. And when they couldn't control me, they erased me." His words sent chills down my spine. It was like hearing my own story, just a generation removed. "Your dad sided with them back then," Rob continued. "He didn't want to rock the boat. I think deep down, he knew what they were doing was wrong, but it was easier to go along with it than to stand up to them." Hearing that hit me like a punch to the gut. My dad had learned this behavior from his own parents, and now he was doing the same thing to me. By the time I hung up, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about me or even my relationship with my parents. This was a toxic cycle that had been repeating itself for generations. And I was determined to break it. After my conversation with Uncle Rob, things started to make more sense. It wasn't just my parents. It was the whole family dynamic. This toxic, tangled web of control and manipulation that had been passed down like a twisted family heirloom. It explained why my parents didn't see anything wrong with their actions. In their minds, they weren't hurting me. They were just continuing a pattern they believed was normal. And Rachel, she thrived in it, so of course she would defend it. Why wouldn't she? She was the beneficiary of that favoritism, the golden child who had never felt the sting of being second-best. But understanding didn't make it hurt any less. The next day, I sat with Tom in our living room, replaying my conversation with Rob. "So this has been going on for decades," I said, still processing it all. "My grandparents manipulated Rob the same way, and Dad stood by and let it happen. And now, here we are." Tom leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It sounds like your dad never learned how to break free from it. He just inherited it." I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. Rob's words kept echoing in my head. When they couldn't control me, they erased me. Was that what was happening now? Were my parents erasing me, turning the family against me because I refused to play their game? The thought made my chest tighten, but it also solidified something inside me. I wasn't going to let them win. The texts and calls from family continued over the next week, each one more exhausting than the last. Most of them repeated the same tired arguments, that I was selfish, that I was overreacting, that I needed to apologize and make things right. But one message stood out. It was from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. "Hey, Emily," it read. I don't know if you want to hear this, but I think you're doing the right thing. I've seen how your parents treat you compared to Rachel, and it's not fair. Stay strong." I stared at the message for a long time, my heart heavy with gratitude. It was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged what I was going through without judgment or blame. But even that small moment of validation couldn't erase the weight of the situation. That evening, I got another voicemail, this time from my dad. His voice was different, tired, almost defeated. "Emily, I don't want to fight anymore," he said. "Can we just talk? I'm willing to listen if you're open to it." I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call him back to hear what he had to say, but another part of me, the part that had spent years being dismissed and manipulated, was screaming not to fall into the trap again. I sat with Tom that night, going over every possible scenario. "What if he's genuine this time?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom looked at me with a mixture of empathy and caution. "Then you listen, but you need to be ready for the possibility that he's not. If you go into this, you need to protect yourself." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. He was right. If I opened that door, I needed to be prepared for whatever came through. The next morning, I decided to meet with my dad. We agreed to meet at a cafe halfway between our homes. I got there early, my stomach in knots. I wasn't sure what to expect. An apology, another lecture, a justification for everything that had happened. When my dad walked in, he looked smaller, not physically, but emotionally. Like the weight of the situation had taken something out of him. We exchanged awkward pleasantries, then sat down. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, "about everything that's happened, about how we've treated you." I braced myself, waiting for the but. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet, "for how things went with the wedding, for how we made you feel." It wasn't the apology I had imagined. It wasn't grand or emotional, but it was something. He went on to explain that he had spoken to some of our relatives, asking them to back off. He admitted that the invoice had been a mistake, though he still tried to frame it as a misunderstanding. "We never meant to hurt you," he said, sliding something across the table. "It was the check I had sent them. We want you to take this back," he said. "It was never about the money." I stared at the check, my emotions a tangled mess. For years I had wanted my parents to see me, to acknowledge the ways they had hurt me. And now, here he was, offering, what? Closure? An olive branch? But it wasn't enough. "I'm not taking it back," I said, my voice steady. "This isn't about the money, Dad. It never was. It's about how you've treated me my whole life, about how Rachel has always come first, no matter what. You don't fix that with a check." He looked frustrated, like he didn't know what else to say. "Emily, I don't want to lose you," he said finally. "We've made mistakes, but we're still your family." I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "I don't want to lose you either," I said. "But I can't go back to the way things were. I need time, space to heal, and if you can't respect that, then maybe we do need some distance." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. When we parted ways, I didn't feel the closure I had hoped for. There was no grand resolution, no sweeping moment of forgiveness. But there was clarity. I wasn't going to let them control me anymore. Walking out of that cafe, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, and something I hadn't felt in a long time. Resolve. I didn't have the closure I'd hoped for, but I had said what I needed to say. My dad's attempt to return the money felt like an effort, but it wasn't enough to undo years of being treated as less than. When I got home, Tom was waiting for me. He didn't ask for details right away. He just wrapped me in a hug and let me stand there silent while I sorted through my thoughts. "I told him I need space," I finally said. Tom nodded, not surprised. "How did he take it?" I shrugged. "He said he understood, but I'm not sure if he really does. I think he wants things to go back to normal, but..." I paused, searching for the right words. "I can't go back to what normal was, not anymore." And that was the truth. For years I had bent over backward to keep the peace, swallowing my feelings to avoid rocking the boat. But now I saw the cycle for what it was. Manipulation disguised as love, control masquerading as concern. The days that followed were quieter, but not by much. My dad had kept his word about asking some family members to back off, but Rachel was as relentless as ever. I stopped answering her calls and texts, which only made her angrier. "You're acting like a child," one of her texts read. "Grow up and stop punishing mom and dad for trying to help you." It didn't hurt the way it might have before. I realized Rachel wasn't really angry at me. She was angry at the idea that her perfect little world could be questioned. She thrived under my parents' favoritism, and me standing up for myself was a threat to that dynamic. I stopped responding altogether. Instead, I focused on my own life. Tom, and I started spending more time planning for the future, our next steps as a couple. We talked about taking a trip, just the two of us, to somewhere peaceful where we could breathe without the weight of family drama hanging over us. For the first time in weeks, I felt lighter. But it wasn't just the distance from my family that brought that feeling. It was the realization that I didn't have to play their game anymore. I had spent so much of my life trying to prove I was worthy of their love and approval, but now I saw that their approval came with strings I wasn't willing to accept. About a week after the meeting with my dad, I got a message from Uncle Rob. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I smiled, grateful for his quiet support. "Better," I replied. "Thank you for reaching out. I think I needed to hear your story. It helped me understand a lot." His reply was almost immediate. "You're strong, Emily. Breaking the cycle isn't easy, but it's worth it. Don't let them pull you back in." I read his words over and over, letting them sink in. Breaking the cycle, that was exactly what I was trying to do. And it wasn't just about me. If Tom and I ever had kids, I didn't want to pass this legacy of manipulation and conditional love onto them. I wanted to build something better, something healthier. As the weeks turned into months, the noise from my family began to fade. The calls and messages became less frequent, and eventually they stopped altogether. Rachel's silence was deafening at first, but it didn't take long for me to realize that her absence wasn't a loss. It was a relief. I thought about my dad from time to time, wondering if he was still wrestling with everything I'd said. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. I knew that any change would have to come from him, and I couldn't force it. One evening, as Tom and I were cooking dinner, I looked at him and smiled. "What's that look for?" he asked, grinning back at me. "I'm just happy," I said simply. It was true. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the weight of trying to measure up to an impossible standard, free from the guilt of not being enough. And while there were still moments of doubt, days when I wondered if I'd done the right thing by cutting ties, I reminded myself of everything I had gained: peace, clarity, and a future that was truly my own. Some wounds take time to heal, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to let them scar. So, this is where I leave things. I don't know what the future holds with my parents, or if there's a chance for real reconciliation. But for now, I'm focused on building the life I deserve, with people who love and respect me for who I am, not for what I can give them. And that's enough. Thank you to everyone who followed my story, who offered support and advice when I needed it most. You helped me see that it's okay to stand up for myself, to set boundaries, and to choose peace over toxicity. Here's to brighter days ahead. Story 2. This tale is titled, "My Aunt Stole My Fiancé for Her Daughter." Now everyone's wailing after I snatched the trust fund. Hey everyone, the channel's been slowing down a bit, and I spend so much time locating these tales for you. If you love the article, please press the subscribe button. It means the world and helps keep this adventure going strong. Let's grow together. Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, "I'm 28 years old, and up until last year I believed I had my life perfectly worked out. I was engaged to Nate, 27, the man I thought was the love of my life. We met in college, but back then we were simply acquaintances. He was nice and witty, but we didn't hang around in the same circles. After graduation, we reconnected at a mutual friend's party. And that's when everything changed. We clicked almost instantaneously and started dating not long after. For 4 years, we developed what I thought was a stable friendship. After spending a weekend in the mountains, he asked me to marry him, and I felt like the luckiest woman alive. It was significant that we got engaged. We celebrated with family and close friends at a little ceremony. I invited my aunt and cousin Mia, but to be honest, I only did so out of duty. I've never been close to my aunt. She is the type of person who always looks for ways to improve her and her daughter's image by disparaging others. In addition to being 4 years younger than me and incredibly attractive, Mia is also about as smart as a rock dot. However, my aunt has consistently made absurd comparisons between Mia and me, acting as though Mia is the best child. Mia's grades in middle school were somewhat higher than mine, so she once compared her 8th grade report card to my 1st grade report card from grade 12 and judged Mia to be better intellectually. Apparently, it made no difference that I went to college after graduating high school with honors. I didn't give my aunt and Mia going to the engagement much thought, even though we had a tense relationship. After all, they were family, and my aunt was among those who seemed to be enchanted by Nate. She would not stop raving over him, saying things like, "Look at how successful he is and he's so handsome. You truly struck gold, didn't you?" Looking back, I realized that it was more than adoration. Even though at the time I thought she was just being her typical over-the-top self. It was something else. A few months later, Nate and I were organizing our October wedding. Everything was ready to go, but I had to depart for a summer program in the UK. We had chosen a location, begun compiling a guest list, and even paid deposits to a few of the suppliers. However, Nate seemed to be in favor of my vacation. In hindsight, I questioned whether he was acting during my time overseas. We continued to communicate via text and phone calls, but after the first few weeks, something changed. He began to justify his inability to speak. For example, being overworked or simply exhausted. I thought we could make it, but I thought the distance was wearing us down. We weren't a brand new pair after all. We were supported by years of love and faith. That was my initial thought anyway. A month or so into my journey, the frequency and length of our conversations decreased. He dismissed my question about how he was feeling, claiming that he was simply stressed. Then he stopped responding altogether a week before my program concluded. I texted, called, and even sent him an email, but he didn't respond. I was initially concerned that he might be dealing with a personal matter, or that something had happened at work. He wasn't prepared to discuss it. However, as the days passed, I began to suspect that something was quite wrong. "We'll figure it out when I get home," I promised myself. I immediately hurried to my apartment after I got back in the hopes of finding a note from him. My aunt was waiting at my door instead. She sent me a printed invitation to her wedding. Yes, I was informed that Nate was getting married to me by a real printed invitation in the era of emails. I initially believed it to be a perverse joke. Even though I asked her what she was talking about with a nervous laugh, her arrogant look made it clear that she wasn't joking. "I'm very sorry, sweetie," she said, but her tone was not one of regret. "You must realize that it is not anyone's fault when people fall out of love, even though I know this must be difficult for you." I gazed at her, attempting to comprehend her words. Only a few weeks ago, Nate and I were organizing a wedding. Now he was getting married to my cousin. There was no sense in it. My aunt filled in the blanks as soon as she saw that I was confused. In agonizing detail, she described how Nate had turned to Mia for solace because he had been lonely while I was away. She described how Nate had proposed to Mia like a traditional gentleman and confessed his love for her over coffee, making it sound like some kind of romantic fairy tale. Each of her words pierced deeper than the one before it. What I was hearing was unbelievable. Then came the insults that were passed off as care. "Dear," she said, her voice brimming with phony sympathy, "you can't blame me. You are aware of her beauty. She is not to blame. She captured Nate's heart. Perhaps you ought to reconsider your decision to travel to the UK. Long distance can be so hard on a relationship." She even had the nerve to suggest that I should be happy for them, stating at least he'll still be part of the family. I was too astonished to answer. I wanted to yell at her, to tell her to get out of my sight, but the words wouldn't come. I just stood there, tears flowing down my face as she resumed her harsh monologue. Finally, I managed to tell her to leave, though my voice was faint and weak. She smirked, rubbed my shoulder like I was some poor child, and said, "Don't be disheartened, dear. I'm sure you'll find someone else." Maybe an older divorced man who's seeking for a second chance at love. When she went, I slumped on my couch and cried harder than I ever had in my life. I felt humiliated, betrayed, and absolutely crushed. Nate The guy I had loved and trusted had not only cheated on me, but had done so with my own cousin. And it had delighted my aunt, who had always denigrated me, to thrust it in my face. One thing was obvious, but I had no idea how I was going to proceed. After my aunt's humiliating visit, I couldn't stay in this place with people who would always remind me of what I had lost. I was in a daze for the next few days. I hardly slept, ate, or did anything but mentally reenact the entire incident. How did this occur? Nate hadn't really explained anything to me. No resolution, nothing but quiet. It turns out that he had been planning a life with someone else, even though I had assumed we were creating a life together. And I'm not the only one. The one person my aunt had consistently set against me was my cousin. I couldn't even face my friends or co-workers for a while. The questions and the pity glances were things I didn't want to deal with. Everyone was aware that we were engaged. How were they unable to? We had a lavish engagement celebration, complete with pictures on social media and romantic postings about how fortunate we were to have met. I couldn't stop thinking about how foolish I must have appeared. When my mother, bless her, learned of what had transpired, she came to be with me for a week. My rock has always been her. And it was a little easier with her there. She was there for me when I needed her, but she didn't force me to discuss it. We tried to chuckle at the ridiculousness of the scenario while eating ice cream straight out of the container and watching terrible TV for hours. She even made a joke. If he was able to do this to you, at least you were spared a bullet. What a wonderful husband he would have been. It was helpful, but as soon as she departed, I felt lonely again. There were recollections of Nate and the coffee shop we frequented on Saturday mornings everywhere I went, the park in which he made his proposal, even the table in the kitchen where we had sat for many a night discussing our future together. It was oppressive. I was aware that I had to leave the city. I needed a new beginning, away from all the things that reminded me of what I had lost. I began submitting applications for work overseas, something I had considered doing prior to Nate's arrival. I found a good work in Leeds, UK within a few weeks, and it was more than simply a job. It was a chance to start again. With a mixture of worry and hope, I packed up my flat, bid my mother farewell, and boarded an aircraft. At first it was daunting to move to a new city, much less a foreign nation. For the first several weeks, I felt totally out of place because I didn't know anyone. However, as the days stretched into weeks, I began to regain my balance. The work kept me occupied, and my co-workers were friendly. To keep my thoughts busy, I immersed myself into my new job, staying late and volunteering for extra tasks. The pain in my chest started to lessen gradually. A few months after I had moved in, my mother called me one day, and it completely transformed my life. When she told me about a recent family get-together, she sounded nearly ecstatic. It seems that my aunt had been gushing about Nate and Mia's impending nuptials and how wonderful they were together. Then someone inquired as to Nate's occupation. My mother was well aware that Nate had left his job to follow his love of writing. I made the decision to remain silent and let my aunt answer the question. Assuming that Nate was still employed, my aunt boldly announced to everyone that he worked in finance. It was not long before someone revealed the truth. "Oh, I thought he quit his job last year," added another relative. "He wants to be a writer now, doesn't he?" my mother said. As my aunt stumbled through an excuse about how writing is such a great profession, her cheeks grew crimson red. However, the harm had already been done. When she married me off to someone who didn't even have a steady job, my aunt understood what she had done. I felt in control as my mother told the story for the first time in months, and I couldn't stop laughing. Nate S. charisma had blinded my aunt, who had always denigrated me, to the point that she didn't even attempt to look past the surface. Mia, who had never worked a day in her life, was forced to accept a part-time job as a receptionist to help support her son-in-law, who was now unable to pay the expenses. I felt like my wounded pride was being soothed by hearing this. I realized that I was better off without Nate after feeling like the loser in this arrangement for so long. I had lost a loved one, to be sure, but what had they gained? A life of lies and a broke writer? The best thing, though? Nate and I still had a combined trust fund, according to my mother. Back when we were engaged. Together, we had begun to save for the future. Since I was in charge of our money, I had complete access to it. After everything that had transpired, I had forgotten about it entirely. It felt like a present now. I quickly closed the account and moved the funds to my personal savings. Yes, technically Nate owned 20% of it. However, I felt it was more than fair given everything I had done to help him, including paying for his groceries, housing, and even his creative costs after he lost his work. I had no doubt that Nate would eventually come after the money. He was too conceited to believe that I would truly do such a thing. However, I felt as though I had regained control for the first time in months. I was no longer the victim. Nate and Maya could create a life together without my help or financial support. I focused on myself and worked hard for months as I adapted to my new life in Leeds. Until Christmas came along, I hadn't given Nate or my family back home any thought. The drama returned to me at that point. Nate's arrival to my mother's place was the first step. I spent the holidays away from home. I had made the decision to stay away and spend Christmas in Leeds. However, that didn't deter him. My mother claims that he came on her door asking to speak with me and insisted on discussing the trust fund. When Dad began to rage about me stealing his money, my mom didn't know what he was talking about. She swiftly silenced him, telling him that my daughter had every right to take anything. Nate, however, would have none of it. He insisted that I had to give him his portion of the trust fund because it was our money. I could almost hear my mom rolling her eyes on the phone when she subsequently informed me about this. Nate came sniffing around, and I wasn't shocked. This was just another instance of his attempt to take advantage of the circumstance, and he had always been good at playing the victim. His audacity was what caught me off guard. Did he truly believe he could be unfaithful to me, get married to my cousin, and then return with a request for money as if nothing had occurred? Nate chose to send me a direct email a few days after Christmas. He spoke in a strained, even pitiful tone. He said he needed the trust fund funds to settle his past due rent since he was about to be evicted. He even had the gall to accuse me of being selfish for refusing to give the money. You have no idea how difficult things have been for Mia and me. He wrote as though I should be interested in their hardships. I ignored the email because of what they had done to me. However, Nate continued to be Nate. A few days later, he tried a different strategy in another email. He acknowledged his mistakes and expressed regret for the way our relationship had ended. He expressed sorry for causing me pain and hoped that we could put it behind us. Naturally, though, the email's true intent was obvious. He desired the cash. He even made an attempt to guilt me by claiming, "Given everything we had in common, I thought you would be more understanding." It was a ridiculous comprehension. After he ruined our relationship and made me feel ashamed. No way. Nevertheless, I chose to respond. I wanted to clarify one thing, not because I owed him anything. I informed him that he had no claim to the trust fund and that it was no longer there. Think of it as payback for all the money I provided for you while you pursued your goals. I composed. I then blocked him. Naturally, though, it didn't stop there. My aunt and Mia arrived at my mom's house a few weeks later and insisted on talking to me. They were apparently upset that I had liquidated the trust fund after Nate had informed them about it. After they went, my mother gave me a call, hardly able to stop laughing. "Your aunt was really angry. She claimed to have the audacity to claim that you destroyed Nate's life. My mother claims that Mia was crying as she told me that I had destroyed their future. She pleaded with my mother to persuade me to give Nate his portion of the money, saying they were in danger of going homeless. Being the wonderful woman that she is, my mother told them to go and never return. Why is Mia unable to provide for her husband if she is as successful as your aunt keeps saying?" The real kicker was when my dad got involved. Even though she had asked them, he generally stays out of family drama, but this time he was fed up. He confronted my aunt and Mia after learning what they had stated. He threatened to stop providing my aunt with the financial support he had been providing for years if she didn't stop tormenting me. He even made the point that perhaps Mia and Nate ought to have reconsidered their betrayal of me if they were going through so much hardship. Naturally, my aunt attempted to play the victim. She broke down in tears and said she hadn't understood Nate was a bum and had only wanted to protect Mia's future. It seems that she was shocked to hear that Nate had left his job more than a year ago to pursue writing because she had assumed he was still employed in finance. She even had the audacity to accuse me of lying to her about Nate's financial condition. She sobbed. I would never have allowed me to marry him if I had known. The irony of the whole thing was nearly unbearable. My aunt had been disparaging me for years, saying that I was inferior to Mia, and acting as though she and her daughter were superior to everyone else. They were now pleading for assistance as Mia had wed a man who was unable to cover his own rent. The best thing, though? After years of allowing my aunt and Mia to live with them for free, my grandparents finally had enough. They said they were sick of the drama and threw them out of the house. Mia and my aunt are currently sharing a small flat together and are having financial difficulties. Nate is still looking for a regular job, but it seems like no one wants to hire him. I quote, am not going to lie. Hearing about their difficulties was comforting. Call it karma, let's call it justice. However, I believe they deserve every bit of it after everything they did to me. I thought I was finally taking back control of my life by the time Nate and my Aunt Mia were all betraying one another. As usual, they managed to pull me back into the drama, even though I had no intention of returning to the turmoil. My mom called to inform me that my aunt and Mia had returned, this time with a heartfelt tale, a few weeks after my grandparents had evicted them from their home. Mia was apparently in a panic because Nate had not paid rent for the third consecutive month, and the landlord had sent them an eviction notice. Desperate to find someone to blame, my aunt decided, predictably, that it was me. My mother, obviously trying not to laugh, remarked, "They came here like they were breaking through the gates of a castle." Your aunt began to complain that you were to blame for Nate and Mia's difficulties. In fact, she said that they would be living comfortably now if she hadn't stolen that money. Do you think that's possible? I was able to believe it. Regretfully, my aunt had avoided responsibility her entire life, so it was not surprising that she refused to accept responsibility for her part in this catastrophe. She had essentially thrown Mia at Nate, believing that marriage would be the solution to all of their issues. She was frantically trying to assign blame to someone else now that it had exploded in her face. However, Mia's sounding delusions were what truly made me giggle. I thought Nate was going to take care of me, and he promised we'd have a big house by now, my mother claims, she continued saying. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the concept that Nate, a man who had been out of work for more than a year, could give that kind of life. However, there were some highlights to the situation. After hearing my aunt yelling at my mom, my dad, who had remained largely silent during this entire situation, finally made the decision to voice his opinions. He reprimanded her after coming downstairs. Why are Mia and Nate pleading for money if they are so successful? He inquired. Perhaps you should consider why you believed it was a good idea to marry Mia off to a man who couldn't even pay his own bills, rather than placing the blame on my daughter. Naturally, my aunt attempted to deflect. She says I purposefully kept Nate's financial troubles a secret from her, and that she was unaware of them. If she had informed me, I never would have allowed this to occur. She sobbed, as though her lack of knowledge somehow justified what she had done. But it didn't sit well with my dad. He reminded her that she had elevated Mia while treating me like a second-class person for years. Didn't quote, "You think you were so smart? You took my daughter's fiancé and declared it a win," he remarked. "But you're turning to us for support now that the truth is out. Keep me from laughing." That's when everything really started to fall apart, according to my mom. Mia, who had been silent until then, broke down in tears and said that she was terrified of homelessness. Nate lied when he stated he would look after me. She cried. He may not even love me anymore, in my opinion. It seems that Nate had been criticizing Mia of not making enough of an effort to help them out financially. Given that Nate was hardly earning any money from his writing, and Mia was working part-time as a receptionist, a job she only obtained thanks to a favor from my uncle, this was funny. Their relationship, which they had based on dishonesty and falsehoods, was now collapsing beneath the weight of reality. The icing on the cake, however, was when my aunt began to disparage Nate. Conveniently ignoring that she had boasted about their engagement for months, she said, "I told me not to marry him." She refused to listen even though I knew he wasn't good enough for her. My dad had heard enough by then. He told Mia and my aunt to go and never return. "You tried to make my daughter look bad by showing off Nate as if he were a prize," he responded. "You expect us to feel sorry for you now that the tables have turned? leave. I was giggling uncontrollably when my mother told me all of this. The sight of my aunt and Mia being evicted from my parents' home was so fulfilling that it nearly made up for all the hardships they had caused me. I received an email from Nate nearly a few days later. He wasn't requesting money this time. He was expressing regret. He acknowledged that marrying Mia was a grave mistake and said my aunt had persuaded him. He wrote, "Now I realize how wrong I was, even though I thought I was doing the right thing. I will always regret hurting you, and I know I did it." He continued by saying that ever since our breakup, his life had fallen apart. He was having trouble finding a job. His relationship with Mia was in shambles, and his literary career was stagnating. He remarked, "I wish I could take it all back. I would have preferred to remain with you. I didn't even think to answer. What was the purpose?" Nate had to lie in his bed, which he had prepared. He was currently coping with the fallout from his decision to betray me. Fixing his life and helping him feel better about his faults were not my responsibilities. I sent the email to my mother instead. "It appears like his karma has finally caught up with him," I composed. She gave a single sentence in response. "The most amazing Christmas present ever. My life has dramatically changed from the chaotic state it was 2 years ago. The best choice I've ever made in my life has been to live in Leeds. I've made some incredible friends, established a strong career at my new employer, and even resumed dating. James, my partner, is everything Nate wasn't. Kind, and sincere in their support of my objectives. In years for the first time. I'm really happy and feel like I'm in a loving, healthy relationship. Let's just say that karma has been working extra hard for Nate, Mia, and my aunt." My aunt's finances were totally cut off by my grandparents shortly after the eviction fiasco. She had been surviving on their kindness for years, allowing them to cover her expenses and provide a roof over her head while she made no effort to help. However, they decided enough was enough after witnessing her trick Nate into marrying Mia. She was expelled, and she has struggled ever since. Conversely, Mia and Nate have been trapped in a poisonous marriage. Their relationship rapidly soured, based on what I've heard from family rumors. Mia deceived Nate into believing she could provide for him while he pursued his literary career, which is why Nate holds her responsible for their financial difficulties. Mia, meantime, is upset with Nate for misrepresenting his salary and not living up to the kind of living she believed she was getting married into. Several family members have informed me that they wouldn't be shocked if they got divorced soon because they fight all the time. And Nate comes next. Oh, Nate. He eventually gave up on his dream of becoming a writer and got a low-paying job in customer service to make ends meet, according to the last I heard. It goes without saying that he is unhappy and spends most of his time griping about how unfair life has been to him. Even though I've made it plain that I owe him nothing, it seems like he still accuses me of taking the trust fund funds. He emailed me once more a few months ago. This one was significantly shorter than the previous one. A few phrases expressing regret for everything and requesting that we begin anew. I didn't even think to answer. What could be said? Nate must now deal with the repercussions of his decisions. The most fulfilling aspect of all of this is that I have no desire to reopen that chapter of my life. At last, my aunt has had to confront the truth about what she did. She consistently put me down and made me feel inadequate for years, treating me as though I were inferior to Mia. When Nate left me for her daughter, she believed she had won, but now she's living in a little apartment without any money, no support, and no hope that things will improve. Additionally, her beloved golden child Mia is trapped in a marriage that is disintegrating in front of her. My mother called me a few weeks ago to give me It seems that my aunt had been attempting to re-establish contact with the family in an effort to win back everyone's favor. She even apologized to my grandparents for her previous actions, saying she was only attempting to act in Mia's best interests. It didn't sit well with my grandparents. They informed her that they did not want to work with her until she accepted responsibility for her conduct and made amends with me. My mother added that Mia had been looking for divorce attorneys. She seems to be coming to terms with the fact that Nate is not the Prince Charming she had assumed him to be, my mother said. But really, what had she anticipated? When she married him, she was aware of what she was getting into. It was a sense of validation to hear all this. I had been portrayed as the antagonist in this tale for a very long time, the obstinate, self-centered lady who pushed Nate into Mia's embrace. Now, however, the truth was emerging. After digging their own graves, my Aunt Mia and Nate were now coping with the consequences. In the meantime, I was doing well. I had a fulfilling career, a devoted boyfriend, and a life that felt completely unique to me. When I think back on that day my aunt presented up with that wedding invitation, I'm amazed at how much my life has changed. I felt like my world was ending at the time. I felt totally lost, deceived, and humiliated. However, looking back, I can say that losing Nate was the best thing I have ever experienced. I may still be trapped in a one-sided relationship, giving my all to a man who didn't appreciate me if he hadn't gone. Rather, I've created a life I'm proud of, with people who genuinely care about me by my side. Karma is real, if that's the only lesson I've taken away from all of this. People finally receive what they are due, even though it may take some time. My Aunt Nate and Mia believed they could harm me and get away with it. However, life had other ideas, and I can live my greatest life while they're busy cleaning up the mess they made. To anyone who is reading this and experiencing a similar circumstance, remember that things will get better. The suffering is temporary, and in the end you'll emerge from it stronger. Furthermore, it's possible that karma will visit you. Story 3. Because her parents insisted, the story is titled, Spoiled Sister Demands My Lake House for Her Honeymoon. Hello everyone. All I wanted to do was tell you the truth. Recently, the channel has been a little slower, and to be honest, I worked really hard to uncover these stories so that I could continue to provide you with the best content. It would mean the world to me if you clicked the subscribe button. If you like what I do, your assistance is crucial to the success of our adventure and makes all the difference. I really appreciate you being here with me. Let's begin the video now. It begins by saying, my parents received their lake cottage after my grandparents died. Even though we didn't go there as frequently as we formerly did, they preserved it as a vacation destination. As my sister and I grew older, our schedules became more difficult to coordinate as life became busier. The house was largely deserted by 2017. My parents seemed to be clinging to it more for nostalgic reasons than anything else, and they seldom ever went up there anymore. I was 26 years old and searching for my first house at the time. I had saved up enough money for a down payment since I started my first job at the age of 20. When my dad contacted me one evening, I assumed he wanted to check in because my folks knew I was looking for a house. Rather, he surprised me with an unexpected offer. So, have you already found a home? He inquired. Not yet, I said, continuing to look. I spoke with your mom and we both agreed that you ought to purchase the lake cottage. I was taken aback. Hold on, what? Are you trying to sell it? After he paused, he explained. Everyone was still on the high from my sister's recent acceptance to her ideal university, but it seemed like the reality of having to pay for it was beginning to set in. My parents couldn't pay the entire tuition, and she hadn't received the scholarship she was hoping for. Her credit would be damaged, so they didn't want her to take out school loans. Therefore, they decided to sell the lake house and utilize the proceeds to fund her schooling. I wasn't sure how to react at first. The lake home was more than just a piece of real estate. Our family had a history of it. We felt bad about selling it, as if we were giving up a part of who we were. My parents, however, presented it as a win-win. We would rather sell it to you than a random person. You adore that house, and it will remain in the family, he added. Admittedly, I was tempted. That house held a lot of pleasant memories for me, so I didn't like the thought of someone else owning it. However, I also felt as though I was being placed in an uncomfortable situation. They made it apparent that purchasing the house would be a means of supporting my sister, whose schooling was at stake. The house wasn't the only issue. It was about taking the family's side. They maintained that this was the greatest option when I questioned them about why they couldn't sell something else or look into other possibilities. In any case, it's simply sitting there. You'd be doing us all a favor, my mother added. I consented after giving it some serious thinking and hearing my folks guilt-tripping. Even though they gave me a family discount when they sold me the house, the majority of my savings were still lost. I convinced myself that it was worthwhile. I didn't want to see the family leave the house since I adore it. In addition, I reasoned that I would be assisting my sister. When, correct? Not quite, that is. Following the transaction, the first several months were quite busy. To make the house habitable all year round, a lot of work was required. I work remotely, so the roof had leaks, the plumbing was old, and there was no internet. All of which were major issues for me. In order to figure out how to fix things, I spent nearly every weekend at the hardware store and every evening watching YouTube lessons. I was responsible for the most of the work, but my dad assisted with some of the larger ones like rebuilding the roof. Although it was costly and time-consuming, it was rewarding to watch the house come together. It no longer felt like a vacation home by the time I moved in formally. I felt at home there. I left my mark on the establishment. New paint, new furnishings, plus a few contemporary additions like improved lighting and a smart thermostat. Even though it wasn't flawless, the fact that it was mine made all the difference. It was quite a change to live at the lake house full-time. It was much quieter than I was accustomed to. For starters, as a child, the house was constantly crowded with relatives, friends, and occasionally even neighbors who came over for a cookout. It was only me now. At first, the silence was unsettling, but I eventually came to appreciate it. The sound of birds instead of automobile horns when you wake up and the soft sound of the sea lapping on the coast when you go to sleep has a calming effect. I created new routines, such as taking nightly walks by the lake or enjoying my coffee in the morning while watching the sunrise from the porch. I would paddle the canoe or fish off the dock on the weekends. Although it wasn't the most thrilling way of life, I needed it badly. The calm was a welcome change after years of working in the city and enduring the stress and noise. However, I couldn't get rid of the idea that my family still considered the house to be theirs, even after I had adapted to my new life. Every now and again, my mother would phone and say something like, "It's great that you get to live there for free," as though I hadn't used my own funds to purchase the house. My father used to say that he hoped I wasn't changing too much and that he wanted the house to remain authentic. I initially dismissed it. They simply needed time to get used to the fact that the house was no longer theirs, I reasoned. Then the requests arrived. My sister started asking if she might bring her friends up for a quick trip or if my parents could use the place for weekend trips. It always seemed a little strange, but I typically answered yes to keep the peace. This was no longer a vacation house. I called it home. They even pretended that I was simply taking it from them. The house was more than just a place to dwell by 2019. I had created my life there, and I was pleased with my achievements. My partner Taylor moved in at that point. After some time spent together, it seemed only natural for us to move in together. Taylor and I both cherished the place, and it was even more enjoyable with a companion. Together, we began working on small tasks like creating a fire pit near the lake and planting a garden in the rear. We would discuss about our future while roasting marshmallows over the fire in the evenings. It seemed like the life I had always desired. Simple, serene, and brimming with little pleasures. Additionally, Taylor gave me a fresh perspective on the house. I had been concentrating on keeping its past intact. I was urged by Taylor to personalize it. We painted the front door a vivid blue, hung up some of our favorite pictures, and added some oddball decorations. Although it was a minor adjustment, it gave the house a distinctively ours character. Taylor, move in coincided with my sister's engagement announcement. Everyone in the family adored Mark, her college boyfriend, whom she had been seeing for a few years. In particular, my parents were ecstatic. My dad was already planning out how to help pay for the wedding, and my mom started talking about it right away. Everyone in the family was talking about the engagement. Every phone conversation, group chat, every holiday get-together. It was always about the wedding, but I didn't mind. Mark was a decent man, and my sister appeared to be truly content. Taylor and I even started hunting for lovely presents to offer them once I consented to join the bridal party. Everything appeared to be okay at first. The wedding was originally scheduled for 2020. However, it was postponed. Like many other events that year, everyone was relieved to have something to look forward to when my sister moved the date to December 2021. I was completely mistaken when I believed that the controversy around Lake House was finally over. In hindsight, there were indications that my family had not come to terms with the reality that I owned the lake house. My dad would sometimes hint at how much they missed being up there, and my mom still called it the family lake house. I made an effort to ignore it, convincing myself that it meant nothing, but I knew deep down that this would eventually become an issue once more. I began to feel like I had to be extremely cautious around my family by the time my sister's wedding preparations got underway. My parents were still very focused on my sister, and I knew they would stop at nothing to ensure her happiness. I had no idea how far they would go or how much they would require of me. Taylor and I were enjoying a peaceful evening on the patio a few weeks prior to my sister's wedding. I believed that the wedding commotion was taking place far enough away from us to not affect us, and life at the lake cottage was tranquil. I thought my part in the bridal party was set in stone, as my parents were busy assisting my sister with the last details. Then I received a call from my sister that caught me off guard. At first, the chat was quite typical, with a few remarks about how much work still needed to be done, little talk about the wedding, and her excitement. Then, without warning, she asked the question that completely upended everything. "Where are you and Taylor staying for the 2 weeks following the wedding?" she said, confused comma. I scowled at home. Why? As if I were being stupid, she let out a sigh. "That will not succeed. On our honeymoon, Mark and I plan to stay at the lake house." I briefly believed I had misheard her. "Hold on, what? Are you staying? Where?" As if that were the clearest thing in the world, she repeated, "At the lake cottage. It would be okay, according to Mom and Dad." I was taken aback. It was okay, according to Mom and Dad. They don't have the house to give. I own it. She dismissed that as if it didn't exist. "It's ideal for a romantic getaway. We won't have to pay for a hotel, plus it's romantic and private. Additionally, you can spend a few weeks somewhere else with Taylor. Not as though you have no choices." What I was hearing was unbelievable. "You want a free honeymoon, so you want me to leave my own house for 2 weeks? Are you serious now?" Her voice changed to one of defensiveness. "Michael, it's not a huge thing. We are related. The house has been yours for years. Is there anything you can do for me? I'm getting married." I inhaled deeply while attempting to maintain my composure. "You and Mark can stay here. I'm not leaving my house. If a romantic honeymoon is your goal, reserve a hotel, similar to everyone else." She began guilt-tripping me at that point. She continued by saying that due of all the delays, her wedding will not be precisely what she had envisioned. I was making it worse now. She said that I was spoiling her special time and acting selfishly. After that failed, she became irate. "All right," she said. "I'll just remove you from the bridal party if you continue to behave in this manner." I gave a shrug. "Do what has to be done." She seemed confused by that. She thought I would turn around, but I didn't. There was stillness for a few seconds, and then she hung up. I half expected my folks to call next as I sat there looking at my phone. And they did, indeed. The first person to contact was my mother, who didn't waste any time in getting right to the subject. "What is this about you not allowing your sister to spend her honeymoon at the lake house?" she made a demand. "It's my house, Mom. I wasn't even asked. She simply thought she could remain here. This isn't how it operates. The lake house belongs to the family. She lost her temper. We've always had it in common. Furthermore, you wouldn't have to give it up permanently. Only 2 weeks remain. How come you're being so tough?" I sensed that my frustration was growing. "The family lake house is no longer there. Remember how you sold it to me back in 2017? I covered the cost. Since then, I've been residing here. You cannot simply choose who is allowed to remain here. Michael, she's your sister." Disappointment was evident in my mother's voice. Her desired wedding was not granted. "You're also destroying her honeymoon now. You want to make her happy, don't you?" "No, Mom," I firmly responded. "I don't believe it is my duty to give up my house so she can enjoy a complimentary honeymoon. That's crazy." After that, she didn't say much, but I could tell she was furious. After she hung up, my dad called a few hours later. His method was as frustrating, but less sentimental. "Your mom and I think you're making a mistake," he continued, referring to Michael. "This has to do with family. After all that your sister has endured, she deserves this." "I've done a lot for her already, Dad," I answered. "Do you recall the original reason you sold me the house? It was to cover her fees at college. I've done more than enough to aid her already." He dismissed it, saying it was years ago. "This isn't the same. She is getting married. Are you small? You won't disappoint her over something as trivial as this. You want me to spend 2 weeks away from home? Dad, that's no minor thing. That's a big request. It's also totally irrational." He let out a deep sigh. "Why you're being so obstinate about this is beyond me." And then I was finished. I am not being obstinate. I'm establishing limits. I'm not going to let anyone tell me what to do with this house since it's mine. My sister texted me the following day to inform me that I had been formally rescinded from the wedding invitation. She accused me of trying to ruin her happiness and being self-centered. She claimed that I was the reason she was unable to enjoy the honeymoon of her dreams. I didn't even try to answer. What was the purpose? Nothing I said would change her decision because she had already made it. I was as frustrated as Taylor was. "How they don't see how ridiculous this is beyond me," she remarked. "It's your home. You shouldn't have to give an explanation." Even if she was correct, it didn't make things any simpler. In between guilt-tripping and outright scolding me, my parents continued to phone. Nothing I said could change their mind, and they made it plain that they believed I was at fault. I was tired, but I wasn't going to give up. I refused to be coerced by my relatives into selling my house. To put it mildly, the days after my sister revealed that I had not been invited to her wedding were uncomfortable. Her silence wasn't the only thing that affected me. It was the deluge of my folks' phone calls and SMS. They repeatedly pounded the same points like a broken record, as if they were out to break me. They accused me of being a lousy brother, selfish and thoughtless. My blood pressure rose each time my phone buzzed. The harshest messages came from my mother. "I'm very disappointed in you," she would begin, before going on a guilt trip about how my sister had already endured so much because of the delays in her wedding. The question, "Can't you just do this one thing for her?" was always at the end. Not that my dad was much better. One evening, I almost threw my phone across the floor because of the voicemail he left. He said, "Michael," in his most solemn fatherly tone, "this has to do with family. Your sister is deserving of her own moment, and it's you who's getting in the way. I hope you give it much thought as to what kind of brother you wish to be." I didn't bother to return his call. I was too furious to engage in a fruitful discussion. I vented to Taylor instead. They're portraying me as the antagonist in this whole situation. As I paced the living room, I said, "I've already made sacrifices for her, but they don't care. The fact that this is my house doesn't matter to them. Regardless of the expense to me, their only concern is keeping her happy." Taylor gave an empathetic nod. She said, "It's not fair. For your sister, you have gone above and beyond. They can't keep requesting more sacrifices from you. They must eventually respect your bounds." Naturally, she was correct, but it didn't make things any simpler. I felt like the bad person for upsetting my family, but I also wanted to defend myself. In the midst of all of this, my sister was playing the victim and posting cryptic messages on social media about how selfishness was ruining her special day. This didn't help. My mom's sister, my Aunt Carol, called me. I thought she may provide some perspective because she's always been the more realistic member of the family. She said, "I hear there's some drama going on with the wedding," after a few minutes of catching up. I gave a sour laugh. You could say that. I told her everything. How my sister wanted to spend her honeymoon at the lake house, how things got out of hand when I refused, and how my parents supported her without consulting me. I didn't hold back. I'm venting about my parents' entitlement and their continual guilt-tripping. There was a long silence when I was done. Aunt Carol then stated, "I'm going to tell you the truth, Michael. Here, your parents are completely out of line. You own that house. It was your expense. Just because it was once your grandparents' property doesn't give them the right to treat it like a family gift. My shoulders felt lighter after hearing her say that. I had been wallowing in remorse for weeks, wondering if I was at fault. However, there was one member of my family who truly got my perspective. That's what I've been attempting to explain. They simply don't listen, I remarked. Despite the fact that I've already done a lot for my sister, they keep acting as though I owe her this one thing. "You owe her nothing," Aunt Carol firmly stated. "She has always been pampered by your parents, and this is the outcome. She has been conditioned to expect the world to be provided for her, and now since you're not complying, they're angry. Michael, that's not your problem. Don't back down." Her remarks provided me with the necessary clarity. After weeks, for the first time, I didn't think it was crazy of me to advocate for myself. My sister and parents were free to have as many tantrums as they wanted. I had no intention of moving. As anticipated, I was not present at the wedding. Neither my sister nor my parents made contact. It appeared to be a lovely event based on the pictures I saw on social media. My parents were worn out yet proud, most likely from all the tension they had gone through, and my sister was glowing. I was glad to have escaped the drama, but I was a little bummed that I had missed it. That weekend, Taylor and I savored the peace and quiet at the lake house. Together, we cooked a delicious dinner, went to the lake, and watched a movie. It was easy and soothing, just what I needed following weeks of stress. I didn't feel like I had to be extra cautious around my relatives for once. My mother contacted a few days after the wedding. I didn't want to cope with whatever guilt trip she had planned, so I let it go to voicemail. The message was exactly what I had anticipated when I eventually listened to it. Her voice was dejected, almost defeated. "We missed you at the wedding, Michael," she added. "I don't think you two will ever get along again, and your sister is still upset. Just know that this has caused her and us a great deal of pain. You were brought up to value family, and we don't know this, Michael." I didn't reply and erased the note. I wasn't going to let that bother me because I knew what she was trying to do. I had made my decision, and my parents had made theirs. It was their fault, not mine, if they were unable to respect my boundaries. The last update. I assumed that the drama would end after the wedding, but I obviously misjudged my family's capacity for resentment. My parents persisted in their guilt-tripping effort, but the tone changed from outright rage to one of disappointment, as if I had personally deceived them. About a week after the wedding, my mother left me another message one day. "Michael," she remarked in a firm yet gentle tone, "I have no idea why you're acting in this way. Your sister is inconsolable. She expected you to support her, but you failed to do so. I quote, "Am not sure how we're going to get over this." As I heard that, I rolled my eyes. Their remarks were no longer as painful as they had been. I had questioned if I was the selfish party in this circumstance for far too long. However, I realized after everything that I wasn't. I wasn't being self-centered here. It has to do with their disregard for boundaries. Taylor was my rock as usual. There is nothing that you owe them. One evening while we were sitting by the fire pit we had constructed together, she reminded me, "For your sister, you have gone above and beyond. The fact that you're finally saying no is simply too much for them to take." It was accurate. I had been the trustworthy one for years. When times went hard, they knew they could rely on this person to step up. In contrast, my sister had always received favors. Even if it meant putting me on the back burner, my parents went above and beyond to ensure her happiness. They had gone too far this time, but I had grown accustomed to it. My sister texted me a few days later. When I opened it, I had no idea what to anticipate. Perhaps it was just another charge or a passive-aggressive comment, but it surprised me instead. "Hey," she wrote, "I was unaware that you were the legal owner of the lake cottage. I was told by my parents that you were living there for free. I had no idea that they had sold it to finance my education. I apologize for presuming I could use it without requesting permission." Although it wasn't a complete apology, it was a positive move. At last, she appeared to grasp the wider picture, and I was appreciative of that. I considered my response carefully. I didn't want to give her a free pass, but I also didn't want to repeat the entire debate. I finally decided on something straightforward. "I appreciate you getting in touch. I hope that you and Mark are content with each other. If you ever want to talk, let me know." I didn't take it personally, but she didn't respond. Even if it didn't make everything better, at least she would admit the truth. Things began to calm down over the course of the following few weeks. I didn't mind that my parents weren't talking to me much anymore. I required the room. Taylor and I threw ourselves into little tasks and made plans for the future while we concentrated on our lives at the lake cottage. Letting go of the drama and concentrating on the important things felt nice. My Aunt Carol called me one afternoon. "How are you doing?" she inquired. "Better," I said. "It seems like things are finally getting under control." "That's good to hear," she added. Keep in mind that you are not the villain in this situation. You've done the right thing by defending yourself, even though your sister and parents may not notice it yet. Don't allow them to cast doubt on that. I thought about what she said for a very long time. I had neglected my own needs since I was so preoccupied with maintaining harmony. However, I had to draw a line because of this circumstance. I also didn't feel bad about prioritizing myself for the first time in my life. In retrospect, I learned a lot about self-respect and limits from this entire experience. It's okay if my family never totally comprehends my viewpoint. The important thing is that I learned to stand my ground at last. There is more to the lake house than just a residence. I call it home. It is the foundation of Taylor's and my life. I will not allow anyone to take that away from me. I have no idea how my relationship with my sister and parents may develop in the future. Perhaps things will get better with time, or they might not. In any case, I'm content with my choice. Concentrating on the life Taylor and I are creating together for the time being. Even though it's not flawless, it's ours, and that's sufficient.